It was just another Thursday night when I walked into O'Malley's, a dimly lit dive bar on the edge of town. The kind of place where regulars outnumber newcomers, and the smell of stale beer lingers in the air no matter how much they clean. I wasn't looking for anything special, just a few drinks to take the edge off a rough week. The bartender, a gruff guy named Mike, greeted me with a nod, sliding a cold one across the counter without me even asking. The first hour or so was uneventful. A few people filtered in and out, some staying to shoot pool or chat up strangers. I kept mostly to myself, nursing my beer and scrolling through my phone. That's when she walked in. She was hard to miss, tall, with raven black hair that cascaded down her back and skin so pale it almost seemed to glow under the flickering neon lights. Her eyes, though, were what caught me off guard. They were this strange shade of gray, almost silver, and when she glanced my way, I swear it felt like she was looking straight through me. She didn't say much when she sat down a few stools away, just ordered a whiskey neat and stared ahead like she was lost in thought. Something about her gave me chills, but I couldn't explain why. I mean, it's not like she was doing anything out of the ordinary. Still, the air around her felt wrong. It wasn't long before Mike leaned over and whispered, "Don't get too friendly with her, man. She's bad news." I laughed it off, thinking he was joking. "What's her deal?" I asked. He hesitated, glancing toward her like he was afraid she'd hear him. "She's been coming here for years," he said quietly. "Always alone. Always leaves with some poor bastard who doesn't come back." I raised an eyebrow, half expecting him to crack a smile or tell me he was messing with me. But he didn't. Instead, he walked away to serve another customer, leaving me with a gnawing sense of unease. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just some urban legend or a weird joke the regulars played on newcomers. But as the night went on, I couldn't stop glancing her way. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care, but every so often I'd catch her muttering under her breath, her fingers tracing strange patterns on the bar top. By the time I'd finished my second beer, she looked over at me and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was the kind that made my stomach twist, like she knew something I didn't. "Buy me a drink?" she asked, her voice smooth as velvet. Against my better judgment, I nodded, signaling Mike to pour her another whiskey. She slid closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, a strange mix of roses and something metallic. We started talking, though I can't remember much of what was said. Her voice was hypnotic, and every word seemed to draw me deeper into some invisible web. At one point, she placed her hand on mine, her skin cold as ice. "You look like someone who's seen things," she said, tilting her head like she was studying me. "Things that keep you up at night." Her words hit harder than they should have. I didn't tell her anything, but somehow she knew. About the nightmares. About the guilt I carried. It was like she could see straight into my soul. The next thing I knew, she was standing up, grabbing her coat. "Walk me home?" she asked, though it didn't feel like a question. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to stay put and finish my drink. But my legs moved on their own, following her out into the cold night. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. She led me down alleyways and side streets I didn't recognize, even though I thought I knew the town pretty well. The farther we walked, the darker it got, until the streetlights were just distant pinpricks of light. I finally stopped, heart pounding. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice shaky. She turned to me, her silver eyes glinting in the darkness. "Home," she said simply, her voice devoid of any emotion. That's when I noticed it. The air around her seemed to ripple like heat waves rising off pavement in the summer. Her face began to change, her features twisting and distorting into something that wasn't human. Her smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and jagged. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. "What the hell are you?" I managed to choke out. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements unnaturally fluid. "You're not the first to ask," she whispered, her voice echoing as if it were coming from all around me. "And you won't be the last." I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I navigated the maze of unfamiliar streets. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear her laughter, a chilling, guttural sound that seemed to follow me no matter how far I ran. When I finally made it back to the bar, I burst through the door, gasping for air. Mike was still behind the counter, his eyes widening when he saw me. "Jesus, what happened to you?" he asked. I could barely get the words out, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what I'd seen. But before I could finish, Mike held up a hand, his face pale. "Stop," he said. "Just stop." He reached under the bar and pulled out a photograph, sliding it toward me. My stomach dropped when I saw who it was. It was her. Same black hair, same piercing gray eyes, but the photo was old, faded and yellowed with age, and scrawled across the bottom was a date, 1973. That's Lila, Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. She died over 50 years ago, found in an alley not far from here. They say she haunts the bar looking for someone to take her place. I stared at him, my mind racing. Take her place? He nodded grimly. You're lucky you got away. I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't possible, but when I glanced down at my hands, I froze. They were covered in scratches like claw marks. I haven't been back to O'Malley's since.
Story number 2.
I don't usually go to bars by myself, but that night I needed a distraction. Life had been dragging me down. Work stress, family drama, you name it. A buddy had mentioned a place downtown called the Hollow Tap. Said it was quiet, nothing fancy, but it had character. When I stepped inside, I understood what he meant. The place felt ancient, like it had been there for centuries, though the sign out front claimed it opened in 1952. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood, beer, and something faintly metallic. Dim lanterns cast a golden glow over the cracked leather booths, and old photographs covered the walls. The bartender was an older guy with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. He gave me a curt nod, like he'd seen 1,000 strangers like me pass through his doors. "What'll it be?" he asked. "Whiskey," I replied, sliding onto a creaky bar stool. As I waited, I noticed the other patrons. There weren't many. 2 men huddled in a corner booth, murmuring in low voices, and a woman at the far end of the bar staring into her drink. Her hair was jet black, tied in a loose bun, and her face was hidden in shadows. Something about her posture, stiff, tense, caught my attention. The bartender slid the glass toward me. "You new around here?" "Yeah, just passing through," I said, taking a sip. He nodded again but didn't say more. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. The clink of ice in a glass, the scratch of a chair against the floor. Even the murmuring men seemed to be whispering secrets meant to stay buried. I kept stealing glances at the woman. She hadn't moved, hadn't even taken a sip of her drink. It was like she was frozen in time. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer right away. Then, without looking up, she said, "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was low, almost a growl. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Excuse me? You should leave," she said again, this time louder. Her head turned slightly, and for a split second, I saw her eyes, dark, hollow pits that seemed to suck the light from the room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The bartender slammed his hand on the counter, snapping me out of my trance. "That's enough, Marla," he barked. The woman, Marla, I guess, stood up abruptly, her stool screeching against the floor. She stormed toward the door, but before she left, she turned to me. Her lips twisted into a grim smile. "Don't say I didn't warn you." And then she was gone. The atmosphere in the bar shifted immediately. The murmuring men stopped talking, their eyes fixed on their drinks. The bartender avoided my gaze, busying himself with wiping down an already clean counter. "What was that about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, setting the rag aside. "She's been through some things. Don't mind her." I wasn't convinced, but I let it go. I downed the rest of my whiskey, deciding it was time to leave. But as I reached for my wallet, the bartender shook his head. "On the house," he said, his tone strangely somber. "Thanks," I muttered, grabbing my coat. The moment I stepped outside, I regretted leaving. The air was unnaturally cold, and the streetlights flickered like dying candles. The Hollow Tap sat at the end of a narrow alley, and as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Picking up my pace, I turned the corner and nearly ran into a man standing in the middle of the sidewalk. He was tall and lanky, dressed in a tattered suit that looked decades out of fashion. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were just like Marla's. "Lost?" he asked, his voice raspy and dry. "No, just heading home," I said, stepping around him. But he moved too, blocking my path. "You shouldn't have gone to the Hollow Tap," he said, his tone laced with malice. I felt my blood run cold. "Look, I don't want any trouble." He leaned in close, his breath reeking of decay. "It's not about what you want. It's about what you've taken." "What the hell are you talking about?" I stammered, taking a step back. He grinned, revealing yellowed, uneven teeth. "You'll see soon enough." Before I could respond, the streetlights went out completely, plunging the alley into darkness. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but when I looked up again, he was gone. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. The alley seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways it shouldn't have. Shadows danced on the walls, and faint whispers filled the air, growing louder and louder until they were deafening. Leave, leave, leave. Finally, I burst out onto a main street, the harsh glow of neon signs flooding my senses. I bent over, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I don't know how long I stood there before I dared to look back. The alley was gone, just an unbroken stretch of buildings where it should have been. I didn't go back to the hollow tap. Not that I could if I wanted to. I tried finding it the next day, desperate to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But it wasn't there. I asked around, describing the bar, the bartender, Marla. Most people just shook their heads, but one old man froze when I mentioned the name. "You said the hollow tap?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yeah. Why?" He looked me dead in the eye. "That place burned down in 1963. Everyone inside died. They say it shows up from time to time, luring people in. Those who walk out don't stay lucky for long." I didn't say anything, couldn't say anything. It's been 3 weeks since that night, and things have only gotten worse. I see shadows in my apartment, hear faint whispers when I'm alone. My reflection in the mirror doesn't always move the way it should. And last night I found a note on my kitchen table. 4 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You've been chosen next."
Story number 3.
I wasn't supposed to be working that night. I had swapped shifts with a coworker who had some emergency, and now I was stuck closing up the Rusty Lantern, a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. The bar had been around forever, a relic from a time when Route 34 was bustling. Now it was just a stopover for truckers, the occasional drifter, and locals who drank to forget. The place always had an eerie vibe, especially at night. The old jukebox in the corner would sometimes play songs on its own, even though it hadn't worked properly in years. The neon sign outside flickered in a way that felt almost deliberate, like Morse code for the damned. But hey, it was a paycheck. That night, it was unusually quiet. The regulars had left early, and I was alone, wiping down the bar and counting the till. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. I was just about to lock up when the front door creaked open. A man stepped inside, and I immediately felt the temperature drop. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and eyes so dark they looked like empty sockets. His clothes were outdated, like he'd stepped out of an old photograph, worn boots, a tattered flannel, and a cowboy hat tilted low over his face. "Bar still open?" he asked, his voice raspy. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to tell him no, to send him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded and motioned for him to sit. He took a seat at the far end of the bar, placing a weathered leather satchel on the stool beside him. "Whiskey," he said, not looking up. I poured him a glass, my hands shaking slightly. As he took a sip, I noticed something odd, his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. It wasn't there. "Quiet night," he said, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Not much happens around here this late." He chuckled, a low, hollow sound. "That's where you're wrong." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away, instead pulling out an old tarnished pocket watch from his satchel. He held it up, the dim light reflecting off its cracked glass. "Ever seen one of these?" "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "Antique pocket watch. Nice piece." He turned it in his hand, his eyes finally meeting mine. "This isn't just a watch. It's a marker." "A marker for what?" "For those who are next." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Next for what?" He leaned forward, his face inches from mine. "To cross over." The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching and twisting around us. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "What are you talking about?" I managed to whisper. He sat back, slipping the watch into his pocket. "This place," he said, gesturing to the bar, "isn't just a bar. It's a doorway, a passage for those who don't belong in this world anymore." I stared at him, my mind racing. "You're crazy," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. He smiled, a grim, knowing smile. "You think I'm lying? Look around. How many people do you see?" I glanced around the room, my stomach sinking. The shadows seemed thicker, darker. The jukebox hummed faintly, though no one had touched it. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The clock on the wall had stopped. I turned back to him, my voice trembling. Who are you?" He tipped his hat back, revealing his full face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they weren't just dark, they were empty. "Call me a collector," he said. I'm here to make sure the door stays open. And tonight, he paused, his smile widening. Tonight, it's your turn to keep it open. I backed away, my heart pounding. No, no way. I'm not part of this. You already are, he said calmly. The moment you stepped behind that bar, you became part of the deal. This place chooses its keepers, and now it's your turn. I shook my head, panic clawing at my chest. I didn't agree to anything. You didn't have to, he said. The bar doesn't care about agreements. It cares about balance. For the door to stay open, someone has to stay behind. I bolted for the door, but the moment I reached it, it slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the room. I turned back to see the man standing now, his satchel in hand. There's no escaping it, he said. You can run, but the door will find you. It always does. Desperation took over, and I grabbed a bottle from the bar, hurling it at him. It shattered against his chest, but he didn't even flinch. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out the pocket watch again. He held it out to me, the ticking growing louder, faster. Take it, he said. Accept your place. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. Please, I don't want this. He sighed, almost pityingly. No one ever does. The ticking grew deafening, each second pounding in my ears like a drumbeat. The room spun, the shadows closing in around me, and then nothing. I woke up behind the bar, the sound of faint laughter echoing in my ears. The rusty lantern was empty, the clock on the wall ticking away like normal. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw the pocket watch sitting on the counter. It was open, the hands frozen at midnight. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge, the windows wouldn't open, and no matter how much I screamed, no one came. Now I'm here, trapped just like he said I would be. The rusty lantern has chosen its new keeper, and every night I wait for the next unlucky soul to walk through that door.
Story number 4.
I had heard the stories about McGreevy's Tavern for years. Every town has its haunted spot, and ours was the old bar at the end of Pine Hollow Road. It had been around since the late 1800s, first as a saloon, then a speakeasy, and finally a dive bar that somehow survived the decades. Locals whispered about strange happenings there, about people going in and not coming out. But those were just stories, right? That's what I told myself when my friends dared me to go. It was a slow, foggy night when I pulled into the gravel parking lot. The bar looked like it hadn't been updated since the 50s. The wooden sign above the door creaked in the wind, the letters faded and barely legible. A single dim light flickered near the entrance, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. The air smelled of mildew and stale beer. There was a jukebox in the corner, an old one with physical buttons and a dusty glass cover, but it wasn't playing anything. A few mismatched tables were scattered around, and a couple of booths sat in the shadows along the walls. The bartender was the only person there. He was an older man, hunched over as he wiped a glass with a rag that looked as old as the bar itself. He glanced up when I walked in, his watery eyes narrowing. "Late night," he said, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just thought I'd check the place out." He nodded slowly like he'd heard that line before. "What'll it be?" "Whiskey." "Neat," I said, sliding onto a bar stool. He poured the drink and placed it in front of me without a word. As I sipped, I noticed the walls were covered in photographs. Black and white portraits of people, all unsmiling, all staring straight ahead. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, lining every inch of the room. "Locals?" I asked, gesturing toward the photos. The bartender's hand paused mid-wipe. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Something like that," he said. I nodded, though his answer didn't sit right with me. The photos were unnerving, their eyes following me no matter where I turned. After a while, I realized I wasn't alone. A man had appeared at the far end of the bar, seated in the darkest corner. I hadn't noticed him come in, and he was so still it was like he'd been there the whole time. He was tall and wiry, dressed in a faded suit that looked like it belonged in the 1920s. His head was tilted slightly downward, but I could feel his gaze on me. "Want another?" the bartender asked, breaking my focus. I glanced at my empty glass and nodded. As he poured, I leaned closer. "Who's the guy down there?" I whispered. The bartender's eyes flicked to the corner, then back to me. He leaned in, his voice low. "Don't talk to him." I blinked. "Why not?" "Just don't," he said firmly. I wanted to press him, but the man in the corner moved, shifting in his seat. The bartender quickly straightened up and went back to wiping glasses, his face pale. Curiosity gnawed at me. I tried to focus on my drink, but I couldn't help sneaking glances at the man. Something about him felt wrong, like he didn't quite belong. Finally, he spoke. "Nice night for a drink," he said, his voice smooth and deep. I froze, unsure if he was talking to me. "Quiet," he added, tilting his head slightly in my direction. His eyes glinted in the dim light, a shade too dark to be natural. "Yeah," I said hesitantly, forcing a small smile. He raised his glass, though I hadn't seen the bartender serve him anything. "To the past," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. I raised my own glass, unsure what else to do. "What brings you here?" he asked, his tone casual but with an edge that set my nerves on fire. "Just passing through," I said. He chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to echo in the empty room. "No one just passes through McGreevy's," he said. "You're here for a reason." The way he said it made my stomach churn. I glanced at the bartender, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but he kept his head down, pretending not to hear. "You ever wonder," the man continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "why this place feels different?" I didn't answer, my grip tightening around my glass. "Places like this," he said, "hold on to things. Memories. Pain. Regret." He leaned forward, his face now fully illuminated. His features were sharp, almost too sharp, and his eyes were completely black. My breath caught in my throat. "You've got regret, don't you?" he asked, his voice dripping with something that felt like malice. I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but you do," he said, his smile widening unnaturally. "We all do. That's why we end up here." Suddenly, the jukebox crackled to life, playing an old, haunting tune I didn't recognize. The lights flickered and the air grew colder. The photographs on the walls seemed to shimmer, the faces blurring and shifting. "Look around," the man said, gesturing toward the walls. I turned and my heart nearly stopped. The faces in the photos, they were moving. Their expressions had changed, their once blank stares now filled with anguish. What is this?" I stammered, backing away from the bar. "This is McGreevy's," the man said, standing now. He seemed taller, his shadow stretching impossibly long. "And you've been chosen." No, I said, shaking my head. "I'm leaving." I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The man's laughter echoed behind me, low and menacing. "You can't leave," he said. "Not until you've made your mark." I turned, my back pressed against the door. The photographs were now glowing faintly, the faces inside them screaming silently. The bartender was gone, vanished without a trace. The man stepped closer, his eyes boring into mine. "All you have to do," he said, holding out a small silver knife, "is take the place of another." "What?" I whispered, my hands trembling. "Choose someone," he said. "Someone to take your spot. That's how it works." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, I can't." "Then you'll stay," he said simply, his smile returning. "Forever." The room began to spin, the photographs swirling around me like a vortex. The faces screamed louder, their voices merging into a deafening roar. And then, darkness. When I woke up, I was behind the bar, the knife in my hand. The tavern was silent, the photographs still and lifeless once more. A man walked in, looking around nervously. He slid onto a stool and ordered a drink. I poured it, my hands steady. The cycle had begun again.
Story number 5.
The gas station on Route 19 was the last stop before a long stretch of forest. It was one of those places that seemed stuck in time. An old, flickering neon sign advertising gas prices, a single pump that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, and a tiny convenience store that sold stale chips and lukewarm soda. I worked the night shift there, mostly to save up for college. It was an easy job. Quiet. Boring. That was, until the night she came in. It was around 2 a.m., the hour when the silence gets under your skin and every small sound makes your heart race. The night was foggy, the kind of fog that swallows everything and makes even headlights seem dim. I was sitting behind the counter, half asleep, when the bell above the door jingled. The woman who walked in looked out of place. Her long black hair hung in damp strands around her pale face, and her clothes, an old-fashioned dress that seemed decades out of style, were soaked as if she'd walked through a downpour. But it hadn't rained that night. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice coming out more nervous than I intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around the store, her dark eyes scanning the shelves like she was looking for something specific. Finally, she turned to me. "Do you have a phone?" she asked, her voice soft but unsettling, like a whisper that lingered too long. I pointed to the old payphone mounted on the wall by the restroom. She nodded and walked over to it, her footsteps eerily silent. I tried to go back to my half-asleep state, but something about her kept me on edge. She didn't look like she belonged here, not in this rundown station, not in this century. She picked up the receiver and started dialing, though I couldn't see her face. The sound of the rotary dial clicking echoed in the empty store. She held the phone to her ear, and I could hear faint static. After a minute, she hung up and turned to me. "It's not working," she said. I shrugged. "It's an old line. Sometimes it cuts out." Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold chill run through me. "Can I use yours?" I hesitated. My cell phone was in my pocket, but something deep inside screamed at me not to give it to her. "Sorry," I said, trying to sound casual. "I don't have one on me." She stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "I need a ride then." "There's no taxis out here," I said. "Closest town is 10 miles that way." I pointed vaguely toward the highway. Her lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll wait," she said, and then she walked to the corner of the store, standing perfectly still, staring out the fogged-up window. Minutes passed, then an hour. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like a statue. Around 3:30 a.m., the silence broke. A car pulled up, its headlights piercing through the fog. I exhaled in relief, grateful for some normalcy. A man got out, dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans. He looked like a trucker, someone who'd seen a lot of miles but was still friendly enough. "Pump still working?" he asked as he walked in. "Yeah," I said. "Just prepay at the counter." He nodded, pulling out his wallet. As I rang him up, I noticed his gaze flick to the woman in the corner. "Friend of yours?" he asked. I glanced over. She hadn't moved. "No," I said. "She's waiting for a ride." The man frowned. "Out here? At this hour?" "She just showed up," I said. "A little strange, but harmless, I think." The man glanced at her again, and I saw the color drain from his face. "That's not possible," he whispered. "What?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. He took a step back, shaking his head. "I know her, or I did. She died 20 years ago." I laughed nervously. "You must be mistaken." "No," he said firmly. "I remember her. She disappeared after her car broke down on this very road. They found her body weeks later, deep in the woods." I felt the blood drain from my face. I turned back to the woman, but she was gone. The man cursed under his breath, running out to his car. I followed, my pulse racing. The fog outside was thicker now, wrapping around the station like a living thing. The woman was nowhere to be seen. "Get inside," the man said, his voice urgent. "What? Now," he shouted, grabbing my arm. We barely made it back inside before the lights flickered. The air grew cold, and a low, haunting hum filled the station. "What's happening?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "She's looking for someone," the man said, his voice shaking. "That's what the stories say. She looks for someone to take her place." "Her place where?" "In the woods," he said, "where she died." The hum grew louder, and the lights went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using the screen's glow to light the counter. Then we heard it. A knock on the glass. It was soft at first, like a gentle tap. Then it grew louder, more insistent. The man and I froze, staring at the door. The fog outside was so thick we couldn't see anything, but the knocking continued. "Don't open it," the man whispered. "I wasn't planning to," I replied, my voice barely audible. The knocking stopped. For a moment the silence was deafening. Then the hum returned, louder than before. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest. "She's inside. She's inside," the man whispered, his eyes wide with terror. I turned slowly, and there she was, standing in the middle of the store. Her hair dripped with water, forming a dark puddle on the floor. Her eyes were no longer human. They were black, endless voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. "You lied to me," she said, her voice distorted, echoing unnaturally. "I'm sorry," I stammered, backing away. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "You said you didn't have a phone." The man grabbed my arm. "Run," he whispered. We bolted for the back door, but it wouldn't budge. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through my skull. "She won't let us leave," the man said, his voice barely audible over the noise. The lights flickered back on, and she was standing right in front of us, her face inches from mine. "You'll stay with me," she whispered, her breath icy cold. I screamed, and everything went black. When I woke up, the sun was rising, casting its warm light over the gas station. The man was gone, and so was the woman. But as I stood there catching my breath, I noticed something on the counter, an old photograph, its edges worn and faded. It was her, and beside her in the picture was me.
Story number 6.
It started with a dare, like most bad ideas do. Come on, Alyssa, my friend Nick said, grinning as he shoved his phone in my face. On the screen was an article about the Whistler's Bridge, a rickety wooden structure deep in the woods on the outskirts of our town. The headline read, Legend of the Whistler, do you dare cross the bridge? People say if you hear the whistle, you're already dead, Nick added, his voice dripping with fake menace. Sounds like a tourist trap? I replied, but the hair on the back of my neck prickled. It was the end of October, and we were bored teenagers with nothing better to do. That's how I found myself, hours later, standing at the edge of the infamous bridge with Nick, his girlfriend Lisa, and our friend Jake. The bridge was ancient, its planks warped and splintered. It stretched over a deep, foggy ravine, connecting two halves of a forest that seemed to grow darker the farther you looked. All right, Nick said, pulling out his phone to record. We're here at Whistler's Bridge, the most haunted spot in the county. Legend says a man fell to his death here decades ago, and now his spirit roams the bridge, whistling to lure people to their doom. Lisa rolled her eyes. You sound like a bad ghost show host. Jealous? Nick shot back. I stayed quiet, staring at the bridge. It looked fragile, like it might collapse under a strong gust of wind. But it wasn't just the structure that unnerved me. It was the silence. The woods were unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, not even the distant hoot of an owl. Who's crossing first? Jake asked, breaking the tension. Nick grinned. Ladies first. Lisa shoved him playfully. You're such a jerk. Fine, Nick said. I'll go. He stepped onto the bridge, the wooden planks creaking under his weight. The rest of us followed, staying close together. Every step felt like it might be our last. Whoa, the boards bowing slightly beneath us. Halfway across, Nick stopped and turned to face us, his phone pointed at his own face. All right, ghost dude, if you're out there, give us a sign. Nick. Don't, I said, my voice shaking. What? It's just a joke, he said, laughing. But then we heard it, a whistle. It was faint at first, just a single eerie note carried by the wind. Did you guys hear that? Lisa whispered, clutching Nick's arm. Probably the wind, Nick said, and though his voice wasn't as confident as before. The whistle came again, louder this time. It was a haunting, melodic tune, like something you'd hear an old man hum while working alone. All right, who's messing with us? Nick asked, spinning around. Not me, Jake said, his face pale. Not funny, I snapped. But no one was laughing anymore. The whistle grew louder, echoing through the trees. It didn't sound random. It was deliberate, almost playful. Let's go back, I said, my voice trembling. Good idea, Lisa said, already turning toward the side of the bridge we'd come from. We hadn't taken more than a few steps when the whistle changed. It wasn't playful anymore. It was angry, and it was close. What the hell is that? Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. We all froze, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the bridge, where the fog was thickest, a figure emerged. It was tall and hunched, its outline barely visible in the dim moonlight. It stood perfectly still, as if it were watching us. Nick, Lisa whispered, her nails digging into his arm. Stay calm, Nick said, though his voice cracked. The figure moved, stepping onto the bridge. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. And as it moved, it whistled. Run, I screamed, shoving Jake toward the other side. We bolted, the bridge shaking beneath our feet. The whistle grew louder, chasing us, piercing through the fog like a blade. I glanced back once, and I wished I hadn't. The figure was closer now. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth, featureless mask of pale flesh. Its mouth was open, impossibly wide, and the whistle came from deep within it, as though it were breathing music. Lisa tripped, falling hard onto the wooden planks. Nick stopped to help her, but the figure was closing in fast. Get up, I screamed, grabbing her other arm. Together, we dragged her to her feet and sprinted the rest of the way across the bridge. As soon as we reached solid ground, we collapsed, gasping for air. The whistle stopped. For a moment, all we heard was our own panicked breathing. Is it gone? Jake asked, his voice trembling. I turned back to the bridge, half expecting the figure to be right behind us. But it wasn't. The bridge was empty. Let's get out of here, I said, pulling Lisa to her feet. We didn't stop running until we were back at Nick's car. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. No one wanted to talk about what we'd seen or heard. When I got home, I locked every door and window and climbed into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. But I couldn't sleep. The whistle haunted me, replaying in my mind like a broken record. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. Faint, far away, coming from the woods behind my house.
Story number 7.
The old house on Sycamore Hill had been abandoned for years. Everyone in town knew the stories. The family who lived there had disappeared without a trace one stormy night, leaving the house frozen in time. Dinner plates still sat on the table, clothes were left in the closets, and toys were scattered in the children's rooms. Locals whispered about strange lights flickering in the windows and eerie sounds drifting down the hill at night. Naturally, it became a dare. "Come on, Emma," my friend Danny said, gripping a flashlight tightly. "It's just an old house. We'll be in and out. A quick look around and we'll have the best story to tell at school tomorrow." I wasn't thrilled about the idea. The house gave me the creeps, even from a distance. But saying no to Danny was impossible. Her infectious energy always pulled me into trouble. The house loomed before us as we climbed the hill. Its paint was peeling, the roof sagging in places, and the windows gaping like dark, empty eyes. The wind whistled through the broken shutters, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and decay. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Don't chicken out now," Danny teased. She wasn't scared. She never was. The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a musty, dark hallway. Dust motes floated in the beam of Danny's flashlight. The air was thick, stale, and far colder than it had been outside. "See?" Danny said, stepping inside. Totally harmless. I followed reluctantly, my heart pounding. The living room was just as the stories described. A half-eaten meal sat on the dining table, now covered in mold. A child's doll lay abandoned on the couch, its porcelain face cracked and its glass eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. "This is so cool," Danny whispered, snapping pictures with her phone. I wasn't so sure. There was something wrong about the place, something heavy in the air. It felt like we were being watched. We moved to the stairs, Danny leading the way. The steps groaned under our weight, as though warning us to turn back. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with doors. "Let's check the kids' rooms," Danny said, heading to the one with cartoon stickers on the door. The room was unnervingly intact. A small bed was neatly made, its quilt faded but undisturbed. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a mobile of stars and moons hung from the ceiling, swaying gently despite the lack of a breeze. Danny picked up a teddy bear, brushing off a thick layer of dust. "It's like they just vanished," she said. I didn't answer. My attention was fixed on a drawing pinned to the wall. It showed a crude stick figure family standing in front of the house. But in the background, there was a black figure, a tall, shadowy shape with long limbs and no face. "Danny," I whispered. "What?" I pointed to the drawing, my stomach twisting. "Look at this." She frowned, stepping closer. "Creepy," she admitted. Probably just a kid's imagination. But the figure felt familiar, as though I'd seen it before in my nightmares. A sudden bang echoed through the house, and we both jumped. "What was that?" I hissed. "Probably the wind," Danny said, though she didn't sound convinced. We stepped back into the hallway, shining the flashlight toward the noise. The door to the master bedroom, which had been closed, was now ajar. "Let's check it out," Danny said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't think." But she was already moving. The master bedroom was massive, with a canopy bed draped in dusty, tattered curtains. The closet door stood wide open, its contents spilling out as though someone had frantically searched through it. "What the hell?" Danny muttered, stepping closer. "Let's just go," I said, grabbing her arm. Before she could respond, the flashlight flickered, plunging us into darkness. "Danny!" I screamed, fumbling for my phone. "I'm right here," she said, her voice tense. I managed to turn on my phone's flashlight, its weak glow barely illuminating the room. Danny was standing by the bed, her face pale. "What happened?" I asked. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on something behind me. Slowly, I turned. The shadowy figure from the drawing stood in the corner of the room. It was impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its body was amorphous, shifting and writhing like smoke, and its presence radiated a cold, suffocating dread. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head, as if studying us. Then it took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under its weight. "Run!" Danny screamed, grabbing my hand. We bolted down the hallway, the house groaning and shaking around us. The figure's presence was like a storm at our backs, oppressive and all-consuming. We stumbled down the stairs, Danny tripping and pulling me down with her. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly. The shadow was at the top of the stairs now, its form stretching, elongating, as it descended. I scrambled to my feet, pulling Danny with me. We sprinted for the front door, but it slammed shut before we could reach it, the sound reverberating through the house. No, 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 Danny screamed, yanking on the handle. The shadow was in the room with us now, staff, its tendrils snaking across the walls and floor. Desperate, I grabbed the flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. For a moment, it recoiled, its form shrinking back into the darkness. Light, I shouted. It doesn't like light. Danny pulled out her phone, turning on its flashlight. Together, we pushed the shadow back, its shape writhing and twisting as if in pain. The front door creaked open, and we didn't hesitate. We ran down the hill, and not stopping until we reached the main road. Only then did we dare to look back. The house was dark and silent, its windows staring down at us like empty eyes. We didn't speak on the way home. There was nothing to say. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the shadow in my mind, hearing the way it moved, feeling its cold presence. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a creak at the foot of my bed.
Story number 8.
I wasn't planning on working late that night. The office was practically deserted, the usual hum of keyboards and quiet chatter replaced by an eerie silence. The dim glow of my computer screen was the only light in the room, casting long shadows across the empty cubicles. It was just supposed to be a quick project wrap-up, an hour, maybe 2. But as I typed the final email, I felt the creeping sensation of being watched. I glanced around. Nothing. Get it together, I muttered to myself, shaking off the paranoia. The office was in a high-rise downtown, surrounded by other skyscrapers that glowed faintly in the night. I took a moment to admire the view, trying to calm the nerves that had inexplicably settled in my chest. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was slow and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on a desk. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. No response. I stood up, peering over the cubicle walls. The sound seemed to come from the far side of the office, near the break room. Probably the cleaning crew, I reasoned, though my gut told me otherwise. I walked toward the break room, my footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The tapping stopped as I approached. The break room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the vending machines. "Great," I muttered, turning to head back to my desk. But as I turned, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping just out of view around the corner. My heart pounded. Is someone there? Again, no answer. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, maybe. I'd been working too much, barely sleeping. That had to be it. But then the lights flickered. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed and dimmed before returning to full brightness. The tapping resumed, louder this time. It was coming from my desk. Cold dread washed over me as I approached. My computer screen was still on, but the email I'd been working on was gone. Instead, the screen displayed a single sentence, typed out in bold letters. "You shouldn't be here." I stared at the words, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the keyboard, it was coming from beneath the desk. "Okay, this isn't funny," I said, my voice trembling. I crouched down, peeking under the desk. There was nothing there. I straightened up quickly, grabbing my bag. "Time to go," I whispered, heading for the elevator. The office felt different now, heavier. The air was colder, and the silence was oppressive, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I pressed the elevator button repeatedly, willing the doors to open. Behind me, I heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, like someone walking barefoot on the carpet. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The elevator dinged, and I practically threw myself inside, slamming the close button. As the doors shut, I finally looked back. There was no one there. The elevator began its descent, the hum of its machinery oddly comforting. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. But halfway down, the elevator jolted to a stop. The lights flickered again, plunging me into near darkness. The only illumination came from the tiny emergency light overhead, casting a weak, yellow glow. "Great," I muttered, hitting the call button. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Then, from somewhere above me, I heard it again. Tapping. It was faint at first, like rain on the elevator's roof, but it grew louder, more rhythmic, as if someone or something was trying to get in. "Help!" I screamed, pounding on the elevator doors. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, low whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry. "Let me out!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Suddenly, the elevator jolted again, plummeting downward. I screamed, clutching the handrail as the small space shook violently. Just as abruptly as it started, the descent stopped. The doors opened with a groan, revealing the lobby. I didn't wait to question my luck. I bolted out of the elevator, sprinting toward the exit. But the lobby wasn't empty. A figure stood by the reception desk, its back turned to me. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The figure turned its head, slowly, too slowly, and I froze. Its face was wrong, pale and featureless, with hollow, black pits where its eyes should have been. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural, jagged smile, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. It tilted its head as though studying me, and then it began to move. Its steps were slow but deliberate, its long limbs carrying it across the lobby with an unnatural grace. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay away!" I screamed, grabbing a nearby chair and hurling it at the figure. The chair passed right through it, clattering to the floor on the other side. The figure stopped, its smile widening, and then it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't have stayed." I turned and ran, the glass doors of the exit just a few feet away. But the doors wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pushed or pulled, they remained locked. Behind me, the figure's footsteps grew louder, echoing off the marble floors. Desperate, I turned to face it, my back pressed against the door. "What do you want?" I cried. It didn't answer. It just kept coming, its hollow eyes locked on mine. As it reached out with one of its long, clawed hands, the lights in the lobby flickered violently. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting at my desk. The office was exactly as I'd left it before the nightmare began. My computer screen displayed the email I'd been working on untouched. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all. But as I stood to leave, I saw it. Scrawled across my desk in deep, jagged scratches were the words, "Next time, don't stay late."
Story number 9.
There's something about late-night diners that feels timeless. The neon lights buzzing faintly, the smell of burnt coffee, the cracked vinyl booths. It's all a little comforting and a little eerie. I never thought much of it until I worked the graveyard shift at Murphy's Diner. It was a quiet place off the highway where truckers and night owls stopped for coffee and greasy food. Most nights were uneventful, just me and Tina, the cook, trading jokes and counting the minutes until sunrise. But one night, we got a customer who changed everything. It was around 2:30 a.m. when he walked in. A tall man in a dark coat and hat, his face shadowed by the dim light. He didn't say a word as he slid into a booth at the farthest corner of the diner, the one that always felt colder than the rest. I grabbed a menu and walked over, forcing a smile. "Good evening. Coffee to start?" He didn't look up. "Black," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, jotting it down, and placed the menu in front of him. "Take your time." Something about him made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. Night shifts attract all kinds of people. When I brought the coffee, he was still staring at the menu, though his eyes didn't seem to move. "Ready to order?" I asked. He looked up then, and I froze. His eyes were wrong. Too dark, like endless pits. And his skin, it was pale, almost translucent, and like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Steak," he said after a moment, his voice almost a whisper. "Rare." I scribbled it down and hurried back to the counter, my hands shaking. "You okay?" Tina asked, flipping a pancake on the griddle. "Yeah," I lied. "Table 6 just gives me the creeps." She glanced over her shoulder. "I don't blame you. He looks like he walked out of a funeral." We both chuckled nervously, but I couldn't shake the unease. When I brought the steak to his table, he didn't thank me or even acknowledge my presence. He just stared at the plate for a long moment before cutting into the meat. That's when I noticed the noise. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A faint humming sound like a low vibration coming from his booth. "Do you hear that?" I asked Tina when I returned to the counter. She paused, listening. "Hear what?" "That hum. It's coming from him." Tina frowned. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. The sound grew louder as the minutes passed, so faint it was almost imperceptible, but constant. I kept glancing at him, and every time I did, he was watching me. Not eating, not drinking his coffee, just staring, his dark eyes unblinking. By 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. "Hey, Tina," I said, forcing a laugh. "How about you take over for me? I need some air." "Sure," she said, her tone light but her expression concerned. I stepped outside into the cold night, breathing deeply to calm my nerves. The parking lot was empty except for an old black car parked at an odd angle. I assumed it was his. The air felt strange, heavier than usual, and the diner's neon sign flickered erratically. A low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, though the sky was clear. When I stepped back inside, Tina was at the counter, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked. She pointed toward the man's booth, her hand trembling. He's gone. Relief washed over me. Good, maybe now we can. No, she interrupted. He didn't leave. What do you mean? She swallowed hard. I turned around for a second, and when I looked back, he was just gone. His plate's still there. His coffee, too. But he's not. I glanced at the booth. She was right. The food was untouched, steam still rising from the steak. The cup of coffee was full, as though he hadn't taken a sip. The humming sound was still there, though. Louder now, vibrating through the diner like a live wire. Tina, I whispered, call the police. She nodded, reaching for the phone. But before she could dial, the lights went out. The diner plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the weak glow of the emergency lights. Stay here, I said, though I didn't feel brave. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and clicked it on. The hum was deafening now, resonating in my bones. Hello? I called, my voice shaky. No response. I moved toward the booth, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air was freezing, my breath visible in front of me. And then I saw it. The man's coat and hat were still on the seat, neatly folded, but they weren't empty. They sat upright, as though draped over an invisible figure. The hat rested atop nothingness, and the sleeves of the coat hung loosely, unsupported by any arms. The flashlight flickered, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. Tina! I shouted, but she didn't answer. I turned back toward the counter, and my stomach dropped. Tina was standing completely still, her back to me, the phone dangling from her hand. Tina? I whispered, approaching her cautiously. She didn't move. When I reached her, I placed a hand on her shoulder. She turned slowly, her face pale and blank, her eyes black pits, just like his. Leave, she said, her voice hollow, like it was coming from far away. What's happening? I stammered, backing away. She took a step forward, her movements stiff and unnatural. Leave now, she repeated. The humming grew unbearable, rattling the windows and shaking the floor. I bolted for the door, my legs barely carrying me. As I ran, I glanced back. Tina was standing by the booth now, staring at the coat and hat. She picked them up slowly, draping them over herself like a shroud, and then she disappeared. The humming stopped. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping for air. The black car was gone. The diner's lights flickered back on, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the night. When I called the police, they found nothing. No Tina, no man, no trace of anything unusual. Just an empty booth with an untouched plate of food and a cold cup of coffee. I quit the next day. Murphy's Diner is still there, still serving truckers and night owls. But I'll never go back. Sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I can hear it. That hum.